Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat.
So it's a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you, John, for that very wonderful, nice introduction. I've known the Kleins, as he said, for a long time, as well as the Spears, and it's always a pleasure to see them and to catch up. And it's too bad that Adam is not here, because in many ways my sermon today is an ode to Adam Spears. Now you'll notice on here that the title of my sermon this morning is Joseph, Judah, Star Wars, and Redemption. Unless you've been asleep for the past few months, if you're a part of this galaxy, then you're aware of the recent release of the new Star Wars movie, The Force Awakens. After all, advertisements and allusions to it are everywhere. It is the 7th episode in the Star Wars saga. The Force Awakens has already smashed all box office expectations and has far surpassed the most recent movie, Jurassic World, as far as the amount of money that it's brought in. There's not been a Star Wars movie in over a decade, so that's why the excitement and anticipation has been so great about this. And everyone knows there's also been a lot of nervousness among die-hard Star Wars fans because the prequels, right, which followed the original trilogy, were horrible. And at least original Star Wars fans were not big fans of the original, or at least of the prequels. The third one was okay, but that's another discussion. Okay, we get it. There's a lot of hype, but what's the big deal? Why would I talk about Star Wars this morning in a Shabbat service? I want to talk about Star Wars for 3 reasons. One, there's far more overlap between Star Wars and faith than you might realize. Second, there are also many Jewish connections to the movie. And third, and finally, I'm just a Star Wars nerd and I want to talk about it. But seriously, think about some of these connections for a moment. The Star Wars universe rests on the foundation that there is an ultimate force. The Bible teaches us that the force at work in the universe, which both unites and divides us, is Hashem, is God, the creator of the universe. In Star Wars, there is a galactic there's a galactic tension between the dark side and the light, whereas the Bible also speaks voluminously in things of light and darkness. Here are just a few examples. These are only a few examples. In Genesis 1-4, and God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. In Isaiah 9, the people who walk in darkness will see a great light. For those who live in a land of deep darkness, a light has shone. In John 1, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness is not overcome it. In John 3, and this is the judgment, the light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light, because their works were evil. And Ephesians 5, for once you were full of darkness, but now you have the light of the Lord. So live as children of light. And I can keep going, but you get an idea that this dualism of light and darkness is a central theme throughout the biblical text. We also know that there is a spiritual battle that is taking place between these forces of light and darkness. But that ultimate authority rests in God. In Ephesians 6, we read, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, and against the spiritual forces of wickedness in heavenly places. Furthermore, both the Bible and Star Wars comprise a set of interconnected and largely self-consistent stories. Both also feature a distinction between the central authorized canon of material and a set of related but peripheral works. For example, Star Wars Legends, the biblical Apocrypha, and in a different way, Midrash. And finally, as a recent Tablet magazine pointed out, both works grow through the gifted minds of their followers. Both the Star Wars and biblical universe now exist in seemingly every possible genre and medium. This creativity also turns inwards. Both communities never tire of delving into the intricacies of the storyline, manuscript variations, wording, and backstory. Sometimes they take their knowledge and put it in databases, like Bible concordances or Wikipedia. Believe it or not, there is something called Wikipedia. And sometimes they even create controversial new theories. The connections are endless, and we have not even touched upon all of the Jewish connections between Star Wars. Like the upside-down Hebrew letters on Darth Vader's breastplate. If anybody looks closely, there are upside-down Hebrew letters, which philologists believe translate as, "One shall be regarded innocent until he is proven guilty." This, of course, fits the character of Darth Vader. We also have Yoda's name. For those familiar with Hebrew, the root Yada, which means know. So Yoda means the one who knows, or he who knows, which is pretty fitting for a Jedi Master who is 900 years old. And we have not even yet touched upon all of the Jewish actors, writers, directors, etc. Like Natalie Portman, who is Israeli, Harrison Ford, Carrie Fisher, the director J.J. Abrams, or the screenwriter Lawrence Kasdan. So as you can see, the connections between faith and Star Wars could be endless, and we've only just begun. So that's kind of the intro. So our Torah portion this week is Vayechi. If you'll go to the next slide. Parashat Vayechi is the final Torah portion in the book of Genesis. And the central thing that is going on in this week's Torah portion is Jacob is about to die, and he gives a blessing over his 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. And we read one particular interesting prophecy concerning Judah, which is important for us because it is a significant messianic prophecy. So if we read here, it says, Lo yasur shevet miYehuda bechokek mibein ragalav ad ki yavo Shiloh v'lo kahat damim. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until he comes, and it is him who the peoples will obey. What's interesting is that the Hebrew there, you'll see, if you look in, you can read Hebrew, it says, Ki yavo Shiloh, and some translations say, until he comes, but some rabbis understand this to be a name, until Shiloh comes. The term Shiloh has been understood within Jewish tradition as referring to the Messiah. The Aramaic Targum, Onkelos, followed by the famous commentator Rashi, render the text as, until the Messiah comes to whom the kingdom belongs. Likewise, another Aramaic Targum, Pseudo-Jonathan, paraphrases the verse as, until the time the King Messiah shall come. If you'll go to this next passage from the Talmud, Rabbi Yochanan taught that the entire world was created for the sake of the Messiah. What is his name? The school of Shiloh taught that his name is Shiloh. As it is written, until Shiloh comes, and it is he whom all the peoples will obey. And from another collection, from the Yalkut Shimoni, the next slide, he, the Messiah, is called by the name of Shiloh, because all the nations are destined to bring gifts to Israel and to King Messiah. As it is written, in that day shall the present be brought to the Lord of hosts. Therefore, we can clearly understand that our Torah portion makes a very clear point that the Messiah, Mashiach, is supposed to descend through the line of Judah. But this fact also begs a question. Why Judah? Right? Why couldn't it be any other of the 11 tribes? Why does the Messiah have to descend through Judah? What did Judah possibly do to merit such an honor? The answer to this question, we have to back up to last week's Torah portion. So, I'm going to give you just the opening line and then I'll continue reading. So in Genesis 44, this is the beginning of last week's Torah portion. Then Yehuda approached Yosef and said, Please, my Lord, let your servant say something to you privately, and don't be angry with your servant, for you are like Pharaoh himself. It says, Ki chamocha kepharo, that you are as Pharaoh. Yehuda then goes on to plead with Yosef not to take their younger brother Benjamin and throw him into prison. We go on to read in verse 30. So now if I go to your servant my father, this isn't on there, but you can all read it, you can listen or follow along. So now if I go to your servant my father, and the boy isn't with us, seeing how his heart is bound up with the boy's heart, when he sees that the boy isn't with us, he will die. And your servants will bring the gray hair of your servant our father down to Sheol with grief. For your servant himself guaranteed his safety. I said, if I fail to bring him to you, then I will bear the blame before my father forever. Therefore I beg you, let your servant stay as a slave to my Lord instead of the boy, and let the boy go up with his brothers. For how can I go up to my father if the boy isn't with me? I couldn't bear to see my father so overwhelmed by anguish. Upon hearing this desperate plea of Yehuda, Joseph is so moved that it says that he then has an emotional outburst and he reveals himself to his brothers. In chapter 45 of Genesis we read, at last, Yosef could no longer control his feelings. In front of his attendants, and he cried, get everybody away from me. So no one else was with him when Yosef revealed to his brothers who he was. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians heard, and the house of Pharaoh heard. Yosef said to his brothers, Ani Yosef, I am Joseph. Is it true that my father is still alive? His brothers couldn't answer him. They were so dumbfounded at seeing him. And Yosef said to his brothers, please, come closer. And they came closer, and he said, I am Yosef, your brother, whom you sold into slavery. But don't be sad that you sold me into slavery here, or angry at yourselves, because it is God who sent me ahead of you to preserve life. In Return of the Jedi, the final episode of the original trilogy, there is a great final lightsaber duel between Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, between father and son. Those of you who have seen it and remember it know exactly what I'm talking about. Over and over again, Luke keeps attempting to plead with his father to leave the dark side, and that there is still good left within him. Over and over, as they're in this famous duel, he says, I know there is still good in you. And the final moment when Darth Vader turns, or should we say returns, to the light, is when the Sith Lord, Emperor Palpatine, has Luke pinned to the ground and about to kill him. Some of you will remember this, that he's beat Darth Vader. Darth Vader is down, and the Emperor Palpatine has Luke pinned with, this force that's coming from his fingers of kind of lightning. And Luke is there, and he's crying out, Father! And Darth Vader, who has seemed so overwhelmed by darkness and so impossible to be saved, has a moment of change. It's an amazing turn of events. Darth Vader, moved with compassion for his son, intervenes and picks up his master, the Emperor, and he hurls him down into the shaft. And a final moment of redemption for the far too gone figure of Darth Vader happens. And Luke was right. There was still some amount of good left in Darth Vader. Judas pleading for Benjamin's life and his willingness to even offer up his own life in exchange for Benjamin's is a redemptive moment for Yehuda, similar to Darth Vader's redemptive moment. And in this turn of character is exactly what moved Yosef with compassion. Why? Because we know from earlier parts of the Joseph narrative that Joseph was both excited and nervous to see his brothers when they originally showed up. And he set out to test whether or not they could be trusted. So if you remember, there was the first time, right, where he hid things within. Then there was the second time that he hid his divination cup, right? And so now what ended up happening through these tests is Benjamin, the youngest of the brothers, is now in prison in Egypt. And now Judah is pleading with Yosef, please let my brother out. Take my life instead. It's an amazing moment of teshuvah. It's an amazing moment of repentance. Why did Joseph test his brothers? We have to remember, these are the same brothers who tried to kill him, but ended up selling him into slavery in Egypt, and lying to their father, telling him that he was killed by wild animals, offering up his bloody coat as evidence. No wonder Joseph was a little wary of these guys. And then all of a sudden, Joseph is confronted by the radical change within his brother. Instead of sacrificing their next youngest brother, the new favorite of their father, Judah is now offering up his own life in exchange for Benjamin's. This is a radical turn of events. This is significant because Judah was responsible for selling Joseph into slavery in the first place. Next verse. Genesis is backing up to 37. Yehudah said to his brothers, what advantage is it to us if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelim instead of putting him to death with our own hands. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh, and his brothers paid attention to him. When Darth Vader risked himself and his own life to save his son Luke, it was a redeeming moment for him. A re-emergence of Anakin Skywalker, his true self. It was also a sort of turning away from the dark side and back to the path of life. You could call it a deathbed confession. And a similar thing happened to Judah. The one responsible for selling out Joseph and basically casting his life aside is now risking his own life for his brother Benjamin, just as Darth Vader does for his own son Luke. Through the substitutionary actions of Yehudah, and we could say even of Darth Vader, we see a reflection of our Messiah. And because of Judah's sincere willingness to be a substitute for his brother, we learn that he merited inclusion in the lineage of Mashiach, and hence the messianic prophecy for this week's parashah. Let's go back to how this week's Torah portion. The next slide. So then we return back to the verse that we started with. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until Shiloh comes. And it is him who the peoples will obey. But the next verse goes on to state, the next verse, he will tie his donkey to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choicest vine, and he will wash his garments in wine, and his vesture in the blood of grapes. Many of our ancient rabbis connected this reference to the donkey in verse 11 with the famous passage from Zechariah 9:9. Next slide. Most of you will know this one. Rejoice with all your heart, right? Gili me'od bat Zion. Oh, shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and he is victorious, humble and riding upon a donkey, upon a lowly donkey's colt. Therefore, many rabbis, such as Sforno, all saw within the similarities of these two verses further proof that Shiloh, that reference in the verse in verse 10, was a reference to Messiah, and that the Messiah would descend through Yehudah. Next slide. And the book of Hebrews confirms this, that everyone knows that our Lord arose out of Judah. And all of this, of course, reminds us both of the sacrificial offering of Isaac by Abraham and the ultimate substitutionary act of Hashem's offering up of his own son, Yeshua. Yeshua tells us in John chapter 10, I came that you may have life and have it more abundantly. We have the assurance that our hope in Messiah is based on a solid understanding, embedded within a Jewish context. Our Messiah, who descended through Yehuda, will reveal himself once again, as Joseph did to his brothers, and declare himself Mashiach. And it is only through him that we all have assurance of our ultimate redemption. Shabbat Shalom, and may the force be with you. So I'd like to open it up to, today was a little more of a sermon than kind of the teaching style that you guys are used to, but I just want to open it up to questions and this idea of Mashiach within the Jewish understanding. And what I didn't talk about is what is so powerful is we talked about seeing Judah within, seeing the Messiah within Judah, but what is so powerful is the Messiah of Judah within, of Yeshua within Joseph, right? So much so that the rabbis understood that, let me just mention this really quick and then I'll take questions. Most of you should know that because, again, we read the Bible with hindsight, right? It's easy to think that all the messianic prophecies work out because that's just what we believe. Instead of looking at it through fresh eyes and realizing you have a real challenge with messianic prophecies in the Bible. You have these set of messianic prophecies that talk about a type of Messiah who will suffer, who will die, and his suffering brings healing to the people of Israel and to the nations of the world. But then you have a completely different set of messianic prophecies that talk about this conquering royal Messiah who is a descendant of David. So new, which is it? Again, think about this from the perspective of not reading backwards. If you're looking at these set of prophecies, you don't know what to do with them. So the rabbis concluded that these two different types of messiahs, one is called the set of prophecies, are Mashiach ben Yosef, Messiah the son of Joseph, right? Because of the suffering servant. And then you have this other set of prophecies that they call Mashiach ben David, that these is Messiah the son of David, two very types of messiahs. And throughout Jewish history, the rabbis have not always known what to do with this. Even in Yeshua's own time, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was a possibility that maybe there were two different messiahs. But the rabbis later, and we know that even the followers of Yeshua concluded, know that there is one Messiah, but that he will either come at two different times, or what he does will depend on which type of Messiah he becomes. So for example, in the Talmud, it tells us that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi posits that if the Jewish people are ready and their hearts are in the right place, then he will come as Mashiach ben David. But if we're not ready, then he will come as Mashiach ben Yosef, lowly and riding on the donkey. So it just depends, right? Yosef is powerful because you have this person who is rejected by his brothers. He goes through this life where people don't recognize who he is. And then he gets to this point when he is elevated, when he finally reveals himself to his brothers. Just as Yeshua will one day, that veil will be removed over the eyes of the Jewish people, and Yeshua will say, Ani Yeshua, I am Yeshua, your brother, whom you rejected. But don't be hard on yourselves that you sold me into slavery. Instead, recognize that this was God's work so that salvation would be able to come to an entire generation. And in Yeshua's case, not only a generation of people, but the entire world, both Jews and non-Jews. So, all right. There's a question in the back.
You were talking about...
Turn the mic on, please.
I don't think it's not. It's on the bottom. Anyway, I can hear you.
You were talking about
the turnaround that Judah made, and the way I had taken him was that there was a form of redemption for Judah, or Joseph, when Judah was the one descending the boat from all of his brothers to keep from executing him. So
it was better than killing. If we go back to that verse, could you just kind of flip through to the one without Hebrew? If you can, go. Keep going. Keep going. Oh, wait, yeah, this one. Yehuda said to his brothers, what advantage is it to us if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? He did decide that we probably shouldn't kill our brother. But he did say, so let's sell him to the Ishmaelites instead of putting him to death with our own hands after after all, he is our brother, our own flesh, and his brothers paid attention to him. Basically, he still wrote him off. By selling him into slavery, he was signing his death certificate. This wasn't a complete moment of repentance on Judah's part. He wrote him off. Good riddance. The blood is not on our hands, but we are done with our brother. He is out of here. And so, really, back here is when you have this radical, okay, I gotta call my wife, otherwise. All right, Monique.
My understanding was that it was Reuben's idea to leave him in the pit, and Reuben had planned to go back in the middle of the night and rescue him.
Right.
And then Judah said, no, let's sell him into slavery.
Right, and Reuben apparently disappears for a time because then Judah and his brothers they pull him out of the pit, sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites, and then Reuben comes back to camp in the middle of the night expecting to find Joseph and pull him out of the well, and then return him safely to his father, and Joseph is gone. And so he missed his opportunity. All right, question over here.
Well, this is on topic, but hopefully it's not too off topic for you to answer. I've always been fascinated with the fact that the priesthood, when Torah was given, came through the Levites, but yet Yeshua, the high priest, came from Judah. Do you have, what's your take on those parallels, and why were the Levites chosen for the priesthood through Moses rather than Judah, I guess?
Right, so you're talking about, the priesthood is passed down through Levi, right, the Levites, but Messiah, the Messianic lineage, is passed through Judah. Partly because they're two very different types of things, right? So the Levites earned that role because they are the descendants of Aaron. Aaron, the brother of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Moses our teacher, he earns the right to be the Kohen HaGadol, the high priest. And so his children, and their children, and their children, and their children, and their children, they're the priesthood. That's why the priesthood goes through the Levites. However, Mashiach is a very different thing. The Messiah is a type of priest, but he's after a different type of order. What's interesting is that, and this is an entirely different sermon, but we know that all throughout Matthew and other places we see that the Messiah is supposed to be like Moses. He's a greater Moses. And in fact, in Deuteronomy it says, I will send you a prophet who is greater than Moses. You're supposed to listen to him, right? And the rabbis, most of them, even back to the ancient Samaritans and everything, they all understood this to be a reference to Mashiach. And so, what's interesting is if Messiah is supposed to be like Moses, Moses was both a king, a priest, and a prophet. Something that only one person could do in all of those rules. And yet, how was Moses able to do that? He wasn't a Levite, right? But yet he's the one who inaugurates the service in the tabernacle. He's the one who anoints the priest. He's the one who anoints his brother in order to serve as the high priest. Moses served in a priestly role, just as Mashiach will. But what we learn is that in order for Yeshua to be the Messiah and the high priest, and but the issue for the priesthood is that we know that because he's not a descendant of Aaron, this should rule him out. But it doesn't, right? The Messiah doesn't necessarily have to be a priest according to most of Jewish tradition. But we understand that he did follow in that line and does become a high priest, like Moses himself. And how does he do it? Because he's from a different lineage, right? His lineage is not after Aaron, that his priesthood comes from Melchizedek, a different type of priesthood that is a legitimate priesthood that is recognized by God, but outside of the Aaronic. So it's still, he still fulfills that role. And again, that's like another complicated sermon in and of itself, or teaching. But I hope that helps that a little bit. So, because there's never been a tradition that the Messiah is both a priest and, well, there have been some, I take that back. But they didn't necessarily have to be out of the same thing, the same family. And people didn't expect, because we knew from very early in Genesis that the Messiah would descend through Judah, there was never an issue of people looking for him among the descendants of Levi. I hope that helps. All right, John Klein. And then,
could you speculate for a moment on, you referred to one prophecy about that the Messiah would come riding on a colt.
Mhm.
Of course, there's many other ones in the Tanakh
Right.
that Yeshua fulfilled. Could you speculate why the people, and especially the religious leaders of the day, of Yeshua's day, missed identifying their Messiah, and what that might mean for the coming of the Messiah again and the current state of affairs?
I think that there's kind of like three complicated answers. But in a nutshell, because everything is actually far more complicated, we like to paint everything in black and white because it makes us feel good, right? But the reality is that everything is really complicated. And I think there are three answers to why many of the leaders did not recognize Yeshua. One is political considerations. Remember, Israel at this time is occupied by Rome, and it's a very oppressive government. And many of the leaders at the time had basically gotten in pretty good with the Roman officials. And so anything that would jeopardize that sort of relationship, and I don't think that they were just all evil. In many ways, I think that many of the leaders thought that they were doing what they had to do in order to save the Jewish people. Remember, in earlier times, people were scattered all over the place. And so the Jewish leaders are trying to keep the Jewish people together, and the way that they were able to do that in many ways was to sell out. And not everybody did that. Maybe there were some who just really were in it for the money or whatever. But even the high priesthood at the time of Yeshua were not legitimate high priests. That they were. It was a role sold out to the highest bidder. They might have been descendants of Aaron, but they weren't necessarily legitimate high priests the way that they were supposed to be. So I think there's political issues. There's also issues of which Messiah are you looking for, right? So if you're expecting, and I think we even see this example in the New Testament itself, when the question is posed to Yeshua, is this the time that you will institute this new kingdom and overthrow the oppression of Rome? And Yeshua said, I didn't come to do that, right? Meaning yet. Because we understand, as followers of Yeshua, that all of these prophecies are fulfilled in one person just at two different times. The first time he came as Yeshua ben Yosef, as Mashiach ben Yosef, as the suffering servant. But then he will return as Mashiach ben David, as the royal, conquering, reigning Messiah. So, but these happen at two different times, and so it depends on what people were looking for. At the time, you had a lot of zealous fervor. But the Zealots were a political movement, right? They were religious, political fighters. And what they were hoping is that this would be the time that Yeshua, if he was the Messiah, that he would reveal himself as Mashiach, and that would be Mashiach ben David, right? That he will set up his own kingdom, he will rule, he will reign, and completely drive out all tyranny. And that's not what happened. And so if you're expecting, just like many in the Jewish community today, are only expecting Mashiach ben David, then they're going to miss Mashiach ben Yosef. And so I think that was a part of it. And the third thing, the third reason is that it's complicated, right? Even Yeshua's own followers don't really realize the fullness of who Yeshua is until later, right? For example, on the road to Emmaus, that we see that it says Yeshua. By the way, this is the one conversation I would have loved to have been there for. When it says Yeshua at the end of Luke's account of this, I think is the best, where it says, they're walking on the road to Emmaus. Yeshua sort of doesn't reveal who he is to his disciples, and they're walking along the way, and he says that he begins to unfold everything about himself in the Tanakh, right? He's just using the Tanakh to open their eyes to who he is, and then they finally realize who he was. We even see in Mark this very interesting progression of the disciples. First, they understand Yeshua as this great teacher. And then as we progress, they understand him to be more than just a teacher, perhaps a type of Messiah. And then later, only at the end, is the revelation that he's more than just an earthly, kingly Messiah, that he's also God, right? So there's this progression that even the followers of Yeshua had to take. And so I think that for people who again, it's sort of a complicated picture to be able to put all these pieces together until afterwards. And then afterwards, then people have to make a decision. And there were many people who chose, for whatever reason, it can't be that guy. So it has to be something else. So this is why the rabbis go to great length in the Talmud in order to come up with other arguments that could discount the possibility of, not completely, these ideas are out there, but they kind of discount the idea that not only that it's Yeshua, but anything that could sound like Yeshua. So over time, even though we have a lot of messianic fervor within Judaism, most of it was kind of weeded out until about 100 years ago. The rabbis sort of now, whenever you talk to a rabbi, they always tell you, oh, well, Jews believe this about Messiah, or they believe this about the Messiah. We don't believe that. Most of what they're saying is they're completely cutting off anything related to Mashiach ben Yosef, and they're only talking about prophecies related to Mashiach ben David, right? Yeshua can't be the Messiah because there's not peace in the world. Yeshua can't be the Messiah because they're only purposely looking at one set of prophecies. Because if they open up the can of worms that deals with a suffering servant, they have to deal with questions that they don't want to answer. And so many well-knowing rabbis and everything, they're purposefully lying to you when they say some of the things that they are. Like, I'm not saying that it's deliberate. In many of it is deliberate, but they see it as they're preserving and saving the Jewish people, right? You've got to look at it from the view of, like, these are people who are trying to safeguard the Jewish people, because anyway, that's a whole other. All right, so that's a complicated answer to the three reasons why I think people missed it. I do want to add this, though, that a lot of us have been sort of heard or raised with this idea that the Jews killed Jesus, right? So what is the problem with this? The problem with this is that now most scholars believe that the majority of Jews at the time were, if not direct followers of Yeshua, were sympathizers with his cause. And so when you say the Jews killed Jesus, the problem is that you're not recognizing who are all the followers of Jesus then. Because it's not until we get into the middle of Acts, with especially the work of Paul, that this message really explodes into the nations. Prior to that, it's only a select handful of people and families who become followers of Yeshua, but it's not yet a non-Jewish message. It's still very much an intra-Jewish affair. Both, when you're talking about the Yeshua story, all the parties basically involved are Jewish. Those who are for Yeshua, those who are against Yeshua, those who are on the sidelines, right? It's completely Jewish. All the disciples are Jewish. I would even argue that all of the writers of the New Testament, including Luke, are all Jewish. Like, this is a Jewish thing. So the problem with saying the Jews killed Jesus is like, okay, well then who are all the people who follow Jesus, right? Because when it says in Acts that thousands were added to them daily, we're talking about Jews. In the beginning, the first couple chapters of Acts, when it says thousands were added to them daily, these are thousands of Jews. The carrying capacity, which is an anthropological term, which means the amount of people a land can hold without artificial means of sustaining that group of people, was only so big in ancient Israel. I don't remember exactly what the idea was, but we're probably talking about not millions of people, but probably a few 100,000 people, if that. So you only have to add thousands daily in order to get a representative majority of people who are at least sympathizers with Yeshua's message. I mean, Yeshua had a great message, right? So even if you weren't quite sure whether he was the Mashiach, you agreed with the teaching. Like, he's empowering people on the sidelines. Instead of elevating the priests and the kind of the system at the time, he's kind of doing the message of also the Pharisees, of empowering the people. The power of Judaism lies not in an institution and with a select handful of people, but with the majority of the everyday people. That every person becomes, in a way, a priest. And his home becomes like a temple. And the table that we eat on becomes like the altar. And the food that we offer on it becomes holy. This is why we say blessings. This is why we do priestly washings before breaking bread. These things is because this idea of it's really kind of a popular movement of empowering the people. So, all right, next question. Oh, by the way, what time do you want me to wrap up?
Yeah, 20 minutes.
Wow, that's a long time. All right, we'll see if we go that long. All right, one more question in the back.
It's not a question, it's a comment. If things weren't complicated, how could we Jews argue?
This is why they always say there's at least, wherever there are 3 Jews, there are at least 6 opinions, right? Because it's complicated. All right. Any other? Or anything semi-related? Anything you ever wanted to ask about? All right.
So I've always thought that Judah Iscariot, being the one to betray Jesus, was more of a zealot, and seeing him coming as Messiah ben Yosef, wanting him to show himself as Messiah ben David, and therefore trying to force his hand in selling him out to make him come as the conquering king. Is that kind of your opinion as well?
Yeah, I mean, there have been a lot of writings over the last couple thousand years of trying to analyze what were the motivating factors behind Judah. We do know that he was a zealot, right? And so I think he was interested in kind of pushing the hand of Yeshua. So I think that that's part of it. But then we also know that it says that a point came where he had turned himself over enough, right? Kind of like with Darth Vader, right? And then it says that that he was basically, that Satan fell upon him, right? Like he was filled by the enemy, which kind of enables him to fulfill what he set out to do. But I think, to be fair to Judas, I don't know if he initially intended to. I don't think he was necessarily like a horrible, evil guy. I think he was trying to take, like all of us do, right? Take matters into our own hands. You know how many times I've heard God say, don't do this. Or just wait. We all hate the word wait, especially in the modern world. We hate the word wait. And so we do our own thing, right? And I think that's what Judah was trying to do. I think he got frustrated with this, very sort of simple, humble message. And if you're the Mashiach, like, let's make you reveal yourself. I mean, that's kind of my take, but again, it's not very clear within the New Testament, so we have to speculate a little bit. And that's, by the way, my speculation. I'm not saying this is thus saith the Lord. Laura.
Could you talk a little bit about the best way to witness to somebody who is not a Messianic believer who's still Jewish?
A Jewish person who is not a believer in Yeshua. It's really difficult. The issue is that I don't think that there are magic formulas that you can say. A lot of it is sort of being the light that you wish to be, right? Usually what changes the lives of people, whether they're Jewish or not, is the ability to see something in you that they feel they're missing. Because what we forget, and I think that this is I'm actually dealing with this within our own congregation, and I think it's a weakness in our entire movement that I've been talking with many of my colleagues about, is we talk all the time about reaching the Jewish people, but we have a very romanticized view about what the Jewish people actually look like today. So one of the things we've been discussing in our congregation is statistics of what the Jewish community actually looks like, and it's far more assimilated and intermarried and less connected Jewishly than you want to possibly imagine. So especially the type of Jews that you're going to be running into in Central Oregon, most of them, they don't believe in the Bible, right? They don't, the reason why they might do stuff that's Jewish is because it's more cultural rather than religious. So to try to, in many of the, especially like the Jewish mission side of the Messianic movement, there's still this idea that is so archaic that if we just read Messianic prophecies to Jewish people, they're going to, the veil is going to be torn, and what must I do to be saved, right? I'm not saying that God can't work through miraculous moments, but we forget that most Jews don't even believe that the Bible is the inspired word of God, right? Most Jews are completely secular. So you can't go from 0 to 60. You have to first help them connect to God. Most Jews, believe it or not, are atheists or agnostic. If there is a God, he couldn't possibly care about what happens to us. Otherwise, the last 3,000 years of Jewish history would look entirely different. As the words of Tevye, I understand that we're the chosen people, but every once in a while, couldn't you choose somebody else? Right? Because he knows, what does that mean? Service. It means so much hardship and everything that for Jews, most Jews are like, why do you want to be Jewish? Like, it's just full of ridiculous problems, right? It's not a blessing for most Jews. And so, it's difficult that most Jewish people, that you have to, let me give you a flip side of this. The flip side of this is, as much as Jews have been turned off to Judaism and the Bible, there is still very much a spiritual spark of the Jewish people. So that the majority of people in cults believe it or not, are Jewish. Because there is something that many Jews feel is missing, because it's been divinely placed in there, and they just haven't been able to find it in Judaism. And remember, for much of the last 2,000 years, other than specific unique examples, the church has largely not been a witness to the Jewish people. In fact, it's been the opposite in many cases, we need to admit. But in many cases, it's the hindrance to why Jewish people have a hard time understanding Yeshua, right? So it's a really challenging thing, and so to witness to Jewish people, there isn't an exact formula. For somebody who is open to talking about the Bible, then you can throw out some things, but for many people, you just have to talk about what God has done to change you. Remember, there's this stupid old adage that people say all the time, but the more and more that you live, you realize that it's true. People don't care about what you know, or people don't care about what you know until they know how much you care. You can, especially in our day and age, this is fascinating that my predecessor, Rabbi Dr. Stuart Dowerman, who led the congregation that I now lead, he led it for 20-some years before me, he talks about the change in evangelism that has happened in recent years, to where he talks about two different verses in the Bible. One talks about the true and living God, and there's another verse that talks about the living and true God. So which is it? Is it the true and living God or the living and true God? At one time, when we lived in a world, the modern age, when facts mattered, you could just spout off a bunch of facts or verses, and that would influence people. We no longer live in a modern world, we live in a postmodern world, and some people would say we live in a post-postmodern world, to where facts are not what makes people's decisions, right? Think about it. We're inundated with facts in the modern age. This is going to cause cancer, this is going to do this, and this is going to... Do you know how much we listen to that stuff? Not at all, right? Unless there's a good reason that actually affects me personally, then I make a decision to do something. I'm still eating donuts, I'm still, doing all the stuff that they tell you not to do, because I don't care about the facts, right? I'm so inundated with how I'm going to die, it's going to happen at some point, and so I'm just going to do whatever, right? So the same thing is true with faith. We think that we can inundate people with facts, and people don't care anymore about the facts. What they want to know is, how did this change your life? That's what I want to know, right? Especially as people become more overworked, have less time, have less money, our world is going crazy. And so people want to know, is there an answer to the way that the world is going? People don't care about numbers, they don't care about facts, they don't care about... What they want to know is something that has power in it, right? In Acts, it's not a matter of words, but of power. And I think that that's what we have to exude. That the type of... When we, as believers in Yeshua, can get to the point when we're healing the sick, raising the dead, like all this stuff, not only would that radically change the body of faith, it would radically change the world. And it would radically change the Jewish people who... Remember, Romans says, Greek seek wisdom, Jews look for a sign, right? We have facts. Trust me, Jews are good at facts. We got that down. What we're looking for is the power of God, right? And so that will change people. When you're talking with your friends and family, and you're talking about, listen, God answered this prayer, God did this, God did that, and that is very different. That's, and you can say, you can believe whatever you want about this, but this is who I am. So, all right, question over here.
So will your next teaching be Close Encounters of the God kind?
Maybe. You're giving me sermon ideas, so I'll keep it in the back of my mind. All right, question up here, Carol.
As you've been talking, I've been thinking how much the Christian community today is like the Jewish community of old, because the main thing they talk about is the returning of Jesus. They don't think about the suffering and everything any more than they did back then. They're wanting him to return, not that we have to suffer or go through anything today. So there isn't really a lot of difference between today and when there was then, other than in the Christian community now.
Yeah, there's been I'm not the best person to talk on this, but I do know that there have been people within Christianity, like its own leaders and thinkers, who have talked about this idea that there's been a segment of the church that is basically only focused on beam me up, Scotty, right? It's a theology that just says, get me out of here. Instead of recognizing that that is a part of our theology, but there's so much in Scripture that talks about getting through the here and now, right? That this is the challenge for us as believers, and it's called, in fancy theological terms, proleptic living. And what it means is it's from this Greek word which means prolepsis, which means I have a foot in the kingdom here, and yet I'm still in the world here. Like, that's what's so interesting, is we live in this world with one foot in the kingdom and one foot in the not yet. So our challenge, and I think the real message that we can give to people, is a message of release, right? That in the midst of this chaos, that there is a message of peace, that there is a message of hope, that there is a message of healing, that, right? I mean, it doesn't help people say, someday you get to get out of this, right? That's great, but how do I get through this now, right? And I think that in many ways, that's a missing part of our sharing of our faith. And not just of our sharing of our faith, of the way that we even perceive of our own selves and what God expects of us while we're here. We forget that we actually each have a role to play on the earth now. Like, our role is to prepare the world for the return of Mashiach, right? So we need to actively be doing whatever it means in order to make that happen. So, all right. Maybe just maybe 2 or 3 more questions.
This is not so much a question, but it's an observation about a story that I read some years ago that might help illustrate some of what you're saying. An older Jewish lady who had gone through World War II in Germany was on her deathbed. And somehow someone was there with her to talk to her and get to the point where she was beginning to believe that Christ really was the Messiah. But just before she passed on, she laid there on that bed and she wept and she said 3 or 4 times, "Oh dear God, anybody but Jesus. Anybody but Jesus." Which gives you some sense of where she was coming from.
Yeah, at the same time, to give you just a little bit of hope in the midst of all of this, remember that every day, thousands of Jewish people are becoming believers in Yeshua. I mean, this is actually a really big deal. That we live in a time where there are more Jewish people coming to faith in Yeshua than at the time of the original disciples. So we now live in this world in which the Jewish believers are sort of exploding. And to give you not only a hope beyond that, the majority of Jewish people are led to faith in Yeshua by who? Well-meaning Gentile Christians, right? It is very rare to meet a Jewish person who became a believer through another Jewish believer, right? It's the numbers, they're far, there's so many billion, what I think like 2 or 3 billion Christians in the world. There's a good chance that they know somebody who's Jewish, and definitely somebody Jewish, trust me, knows lots of Christians. So, and it's not just a Christian, it's a Christian who is well-meaning, right? Who, in many cases, is able to explain things in a very sensitive manner, is able to, right, to talk about, like, hey, Jesus was Jewish, and like this stuff, and because what Jewish people are impressed by is not by you trying to be them, but you are able to talk with them despite the fact that you're not Jewish, right? That's when Paul says, I became all things to all people in the hopes that I might win some. It doesn't mean but this group of people I was eating pork, and this people, right, then I pretend like I'm Jewish, and what it means is that he was always himself. He was always an observant Jew, but he knew how to talk to people. So I love the passage I believe it's towards the middle of Romans, where Paul is addressing a group in Rome, and he talks about the altar to the unknown God, right? And he was able to explain to these philosophers in philosophical terms about this one true God and this altar that they had that they didn't even know what it was for, right? And we have other examples of Paul being able to sort of connect with people despite what might be a cultural or a linguistic distance. And I think that's what we need to be. We need to be kind of people who are able to not necessarily be the type of people who blend in per se, but who are able to communicate across bridges and across boundaries, and in the hopes that we might win some, right? So Exactly. All right, so over here, and then we'll come back over here.
I have a question. What would be the best way to speak to a Christian or a believer that believes that the old covenant is gone and that the new covenant overwrote that and that the commandments aren't necessarily valid anymore to some people?
There's actually a lot of really great Christian writings out there, because sometimes if you try to show them like Messianic Jewish materials, they're already skeptic, right? Skeptical. But there are some really great scholars like C.B. Cranfield and others who write, the issue is delving into the translation of often some of this stuff. So, for example, and I think it's Romans 10:1, could be wrong, where it says, most Christian translations say, for Christ is the end of the law for those who believe, right? Where it says Christ is the end of the law, that Greek word is telos, and it doesn't mean end, it means to the fullness, right? And a lot of scholars, there is actually a lot of scholarship to help support some of this stuff. But the biggest thing is to just challenge people to think, to think more deeply on this stuff, to say, show me verses and actually break it down in context to show that this is actually really the case, right? The closest thing you can get to, if people are honest, is you can demonstrate how all of the mitzvot are not necessarily binding in the same way for non-Jews as they are for Jews, but you can't find anywhere where it says that especially for Jewish followers of Yeshua, that the Torah is no longer obligatory. There's zero. I challenge people for this for many years, and nobody's ever been able to accept the challenge, right? Because I know what the Bible says, right? We have, instead of an idea of Messiah being the end, we have the idea that there might be a sort of modifications to the covenant through Yeshua, but the covenant still stands. That, in fact, the whole thing is kind of like a house of cards. If there isn't a solid foundation, then the rest of it comes crumbling down. And so you have the Torah, right? And even the prophets are built upon that, and the writings, and the Gospels, and the rest of the New Testament have to stand on a foundation. I'm not saying that it doesn't stand on itself. What I'm saying is that there's a foundation, a purpose that was there and was laid in order to get to the unfolding of the gospel narrative. So if you just all of a sudden cut that off, actually, let me tell you a book. It's kind of scholarly, but it's really, really good, especially if you just read the introduction. So it's called The God of Israel and Christian Theology. It's written by a scholar named R. Kendall Solon, who teaches at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. He's a Christian theologian who got this whole idea that for Christians to claim that they worship the God of Israel while having a disconnect with the people of Israel are engaging in a massive theological contradiction. And he also then goes on to propose that the problem with what he argues supersessionism, which this idea that the church replaces Israel and that the Torah and all that stuff is no longer valid, the problem is to even correct this, even with churches and Christians who claim to not be supersessionist, is it's so deep in the Christian story. So he argues, and again, he uses these because he's a scholar, so you feel like you got to use these fancy theological terms. He said what he calls the standard canonical narrative is basically the Christian story that all of us have heard our whole lives, right? That God created everything, he created man fell, so he sent Messiah, and one day, basically the creation, right, God created man. Second is man fell, so God sent Yeshua to correct that, and one day we will rule and reign with him in the age to come, right? It's the four-part narrative. All of us have heard that. The problem that Solon argues is the problem with that narrative is not what it affirms, it's what it leaves out, right? So basically, for all intents and purposes, and I realize this is broad brushing a little bit, but for all intents and purposes, Genesis chapter 3 through Matthew chapter 1 are completely left, they're thrown out as far as matters of doctrine and determining, real important messages of theology for most of the church. I realize it's broad brushing a little bit, but you realize, if you were to look at your Bible, if I were to hold up my Bible, how much of the Bible, the bulk of it is the Tanakh, right? And so, if you're basically just to pull that out, what do you have to stand on, right? And Yeshua's own words, I've not come to do away with this, but, to give it its fullest meanings. In fact, not one yud or one iota, which are the little, kind of markings, will cease from the Torah until all of these things have been given their fullest meaning. And he says, I tell you, whoever does these things and teaches them will be great in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever does not do these things and does not teach them to others, they might be able to slide in, right? Because faith in Yeshua. But it says you won't be great in the kingdom of heaven. And so it's hard for people to go against a couple thousand, 1,500 years of largely church tradition, but there are also voices within the church that have said that there's a problem with this. And so I think when, that you can have a conversation that is sort of like challenging people that, there might be a problem with the narrative. This was the problem with Nicaea, the Council of Nicaea. The problem with the Council of Nicaea was not what the council affirmed, right? Actually, more and more people are saying what they affirmed was actually right on. The problem is what they left out and who they purposely disinvited, right? At the time of the Council of Nicaea, there were still many, many, many Jewish bishops. Guess who wasn't invited to the party? All the Jewish bishops, right? So that the matter was decided purposely by not having a Jewish voice involved in the process. So therefore, the problem wasn't what was affirmed, the problem was all the stuff that was left out. Any mention of the Jewishness of Yeshua, any of this affirmation of the covenant with Israel, the covenant in general, all that stuff was just sort of, over time, pushed aside, except for a few people who wished to push against the grain and challenge that. So, all right. So one last question, and then we'll wrap up.
Can you say the name of the book again?
So it's called The God of Israel and Christian Theology. And the last name of the author is Soulen, S-O-U-L-E-N. It should be easy to remember, The God of Israel and Christian Theology. So it's a really great book, and this is a book by a respected Christian theologian, right? So it's not like skeptical messaging material. I mean, not that I believe that, but you know what I mean? Like, I think it's sometimes we have to, again, being able to speak people's language. If people are not open, sometimes people are just not open, and all you can do is pray, right? But if people are open, you have to assess what level of openness are they. The most of the time when you talk to somebody, they're not at the point of what must I do to be saved, right? They're at this point of, I'm open to having a little bit of a discussion of this. And they might progress where I'm willing to be more open about talking about this, to where I will now ask you questions. I might even read something. Which will put me back here. But then eventually you get to this point of, okay, I'm ready. And that process might look different for each individual, but we always try to push people all the way over to here. And instead of realizing, another thing that this friend of mine, Dr. Stuart Dowerman, talks about is that we're always trying to get people to yes, instead of realizing sometimes our job is simply to get them to maybe, right? Nobody ever got to yes without passing through maybe. If we can get somebody who is on a no to simply say, maybe you're right, that's actually progressing people along the spiritual journey, right? Because again, it's not about us, it's about the power of God, right? That every one of us plants a seed. It's interesting that there's so many times all of us have spoken, sometimes for years we've been witnessing to somebody. And then somebody else comes along and prays with them to receive Yeshua. You're like, so new, but was everything I was doing for nothing? And the point is that it takes a village, right? And even spiritually, there are people who are harvesters and there are people who are planters. And we have the responsibility to be spreading, to planting seeds in people's spiritual lives. That's what our job is. And realizing when the time is ready, and if we have the privilege and the honor, then God will help us harvest that. But often our job is simply to be planting seeds. We have to be doing it though. A lot of times nowadays we sort of say, oh, I'll let that kind of stuff be for the professional or the people who are really good at it. Instead of realizing all of us have a responsibility to be spreading the message of Yeshua. All right.
Well, your comments are an answer to the question that I was going to bring up. They really are. Because I was going to ask you basically, what you would say to a typical large congregation of Protestants who don't believe in the Torah, believe it's been abolished, believe we're not under law, and we see only two people showed up for the dedication of Messiah, Anna and Susan. Only 2. Parents had to be there. The temple rabbis had to be there. And today, what is it that you would say to the congregation? Well, you just said what you would say. Check it out. Look at this book. Very
Right.
powerful.
I mean, I speak in churches, not all the time, but like on a semi-regular basis. And it depends on the congregation. Often, to be fair, I speak in churches who are usually open to you being there, right? Otherwise you wouldn't be there. So it's not necessarily a really hard sell. But I also speak in churches that, every once in a while, I'm always so busy, I don't have the time to speak in a bunch of churches. But when I do, you have to connect with people on where they're at, right? So for some people, they're not ready to have a whole conversation about exploring how, like all of this stuff, but you can connect with them on where they're ready, right? So there have been times that, a couple times I spoke in PCUSA churches, Presbyterian Church USA. For those who know, Presbyterian Church, there's a few different denominations, but the largest is PCUSA, the Presbyterian Church USA, which is very, very, no, it's actually very liberal. And the problem with the more progressive churches is they also have very replacement theology. They're very much centered on replacement theology. And PCUSA is one of the denominations that is voted to divest from the state of Israel. So it's very challenging. So for me to come in, like I can't talk about all the same stuff that I would at another type of congregation. So I opened the door by talking about, they were asked me because one of my degrees is in like archaeology and stuff like that. So I came in and talked about biblical archaeology, but all of that stuff opens doors. So then more and more, I was invited back, I think 2 or 3 more times to this particular congregation. And in the question and answer times, then you can answer questions like this. So, sometimes you can't just come in with guns blazing because often you just lose right the battle. And so we have to look at this as kind of, I don't want to say a war because it's not a war. I'm not trying to kill anybody, but it's a very negative term. But there's a mission, I guess, or I don't know, whatever you want to call it, that we're all trying to accomplish, right? And so I would rather gain some ground than, if you come in sometimes with guns blazing, you're just completely lost, and often nobody will ever be open to hearing anything you have to say afterwards, right? So I would rather build openness and kind of connect with them with the ways that we can talk about. And in a lot of cases like that, there are churches that you can talk about kind of the, I don't know, like to put it in Christian terminology, the biblical feasts or whatever, and people are open to that, right? You don't necessarily have to say, you have to do this or whatever, like that's a whole other conversation, but you know what I mean? Like, so there are ways, I think, to connect with people, and even a lot of the mainline churches totally understand that Jesus was Jewish and the Gospels were Jewish and all that kind of stuff. So there are ways to talk about this stuff without getting into the too heavy of topics and issues. So, all right, so I think we'll wrap up now. I'll be around for a little bit in case you have any questions. But so, John, let me just. So I'd like to just speak a blessing over to you, and then I guess we'll release you all. So thank you for being here. Thank you very much to the Spears who are not here, but also to the Kleins, to Adam and John for having me here. It's a blessing. It's always wonderful to see you all, and I really appreciate the privilege of being able to be here. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmarecha Ya'er Adonai p'nav elecha v'chunecha Yisa Adonai p'nav elecha v'yasem lecha Shalom. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and fill you with peace. Amen. Shabbat shalom, everybody.